This story has been recorded at an Addictive Eaters Anonymous meeting in New Zealand. You can email us at contact@aeanz.org.
My name's Tony. I'm an addictive eater. It's good to be here. It's also good that I haven't really given much thought to tonight. Earlier today, and I went for a walk and thought it was better to listen to a guy called Michael S. rather than Tony S. So I did that for the duration. And but basically, when I think back, I just believe I was born an addictive eater. That definitely born an addict. Right from the outset, my eating seemed a lot different to, certainly my friends and most members of my family. And but also I really relate to the, to the kind of basic bedevilments in the big book of AA, where it talks about, feeling, a sense of uselessness, self-pity, all those sort of character defects, which I think are a big part of addiction for me. And food took the edge off that, right from the outset, so I ate addictively right from the start, and for 42 years, it was like that. So over the years I ate, sort of stolen food, frozen food, burnt food that had been in rubbish bins. I just couldn't stop eating, and with that went kind of, those feelings of sort of uselessness and self-pity just sort of intensified really. And I remember being, sort of 12 years old in a woodwork class at school, which I absolutely dreaded, like woodwork. But in this class, one of my classmates, fainted and hit the ground, and it turned out he was rushed off to the hospital. It turned out he had ruptured his spleen, which was quite serious back then. And honestly, within about an hour, there were people in our class writing "Get Well, Brian" cards to him in hospital. I was queuing up to get his sausages and chips at the school canteen. As soon as he hit the ground, that's all I could think about was, that guy buys his lunch every day. I hated him for that. And today is my lucky day. Selfishness, self-centeredness, kind of. And a friend of mine came with me to the canteen, and where I gave sort of his name and our class number. And people must have known I was sort of twice his size. And my friend used to laugh about it because he said that I begrudgingly gave him a few chips from the bag, but there were 2 sausages in the bag, and there was no way he was getting those. And that's just the obsession. That's how I relate to the obsession. That a normal eater doesn't have that obsession about someone's sausages and chips when they've ruptured their spleen or in hospital. And so, right through school, I was the person that we'd all raid the tuck shop, but people would take sort of jet plane lollies, and I'd take sort of pies and buns. And the staff always knew who to come to. They always just, it was always humiliating, but I couldn't stop doing it. Just that experience, I just could not stop doing it. And for years, what I've come to believe, I think for me, is that perception is a big part of this disease. So I had a perception that I was a fat, overweight kid, but looking back at sepia-toned black and white photographs, that wasn't necessarily the case, So, but in my mind, it was. But when I started drinking at regularly at 14, and drank alcoholically from the start, that's when I did start to actually live up to that image. I started to put on weight, and so when I left high school, I was still nominally, kind of a serious sports person. Within 12 months of being a tertiary student, I put on between 25 and 30 kg, and was anything but a serious sports person, you know, and I just could not stop eating and drinking that year, you know. And it was the first time I'd had my own sort of stash of money, and there were times that year where I was cashing in soft drink bottles to get food. You know, like there was a chicken and chips place in Wellington where they had 10 roast potatoes for $1, and you know, 10 for $1. You know, sort of. So I would go around cashing, you know, Coke and Fanta bottles to get the $1 or the $2 to get the 10 or the 20 roast potatoes. So, and you know, my eating was always like that, and a big part of it too was of the addiction to me was, you know, the geographical cure, moving from one place to another, hoping it would be a fresh start, and it was always the same. You know, alcohol and food were always there, drugs when I can get it, and the depression would get worse, so pills were involved. And so when I was 19, I started a job where I got, you know, sort of basically hoodwinked into taking out an insurance policy, but they wouldn't actually insure me because I was 19 years old, about 19 stone, and I had a high blood pressure and was deemed to be a heart attack risk at 19. Yet, I was still playing kind of senior level sport at that time. So I thought I've got to do something about this, and I went to I went to Weight Watchers for the first time, and I just couldn't stick to their food plan, you know, like. But in my mind, you know, where the problem was centred, I thought, you know, the week at Weight Watchers was Monday to knock off time Friday at work, and then the weekend was mine. So I was always living for Friday, 4 o'clock of it, and I'd go on an almighty, you know, eating and drinking binge, go to Weight Watchers on the Monday night, and still lose weight. And I thought I'd beaten it, you know, because I was always looking to beat it and control it. And a few years later, when I first came to a meeting here, I spoke to a woman who said that she used to go to Weight Watchers on Mondays and get her hair cut every day before she went. And I thought that was never an option for me. But so, you know, that was the start of being in and out of organisations like Weight Watchers, looking, you know, to grab the latest fad diet, you know, the F plan, if anyone remembers that, you know. I always thought it stood for failure, you know. I just couldn't do it. So, and as a result of my addictive eating, I suffered, you know, a bad knee injury playing football, which meant I could never play football again, which was a big part of my life, you know. And I got more and more depressed, so I just ate and drank and drugged more. That was my kind of solution. And by the stage I was married for the first time. You know, we just bought a house. We're about to have a family, and my wife said to me that I had to do something, or she was, you know, gone. And I don't remember seriously looking for something, but I was working at at a daily newspaper, and I saw an advert in the paper for a 12-step fellowship for food. And I thought that'll make a great story. But what I believe was it was my higher power saying, you need this. Because, I mean, I'd seen that ad. It used to just stand out in a sort of sea of black ink. It would sort of almost have a neon sign, you know, sort of. And so in those days, you know, you had to write to the organisation. And so I did that, said that I was a journalist and I wanted to write a story about the fellowship. And I got a letter back saying, well, you know, the best way will be to come to a meeting. So I did that. I came to my first meeting. I can't remember exactly what I heard because I'd come from the pub where I'd been for a few hours, but I do remember being really impressed at people saying that, you know, they'd lived all their lives with the obsession to eat, but, you know, and most people still had it at that meeting. They were exactly like me, but there were 2 or 3 people who said that they no longer, you know, that obsession had been removed through the 12 steps of that fellowship and a power greater than themselves. And I remember being really impressed with that because I just imagined I'd be battling that all my life. But I wasn't impressed enough to want to stop. And a little while later, a couple of people from that group came around and saw me on a 12-step call, and by that stage, everything was hanging by a thread. My job, marriage, sanity. It was all sort of starting to kind of look pretty wobbly. And they said to me, if I wanted to get well, I'd have to give up drinking, drugging, eating, and come to the 12-step program and work the steps. And I just remember thinking about the age of 25, 26, what an order. I just can't do that. I mean, to me, those things were the things that were keeping me going. So I went on my not so merry way for another few years, and I ended up up in Nelson at the top of the South Island, and thinking it'll be a fresh start here. Great climate. Know a lot of people here, that sort of thing, and it all got a lot worse. And one day I was in the newsroom of the newspaper, and we got word of this boat that was burning out in the harbour. It caught fire, in sort of Tasman Bay. And so a photographer and I were dispatched to go down to the port, hire a boat, and go out and get a photograph and a story of this burning boat. So we hired this boat, and we set off, and we weren't making great progress. And the skipper of the boat turns around and said, "Look, I don't want to be rude, but he said, we'd get out there a hell of a lot faster if you got off." And so he put me ashore on the boulder bank at Nelson, where I sat watching this boat burning up. And the photographer went out, got photographs, and they came back and picked me up. And the photographer could not wait to get back to work to tell everybody. And so I thought I'd better do it. And there were people in that newsroom just in tears, laughing. And there was somebody who worked in that newsroom who had said to me a couple of times over the years, one day someone said they come into the office eating an ice cream on a hot summer's day, and someone said, "Oh, if you eat too many of those, you'll be as big as a house." And she piped up and said, "You mean as big as Tony?" And on another occasion, she saw me, I was working at my desk eating my sandwiches, which were probably my second lunch of the day, because that was normally the pattern. And I looked up and I saw something that I won't go into here, which horrified me enough to screw up my sandwiches and throw them in the rubbish bin, which is a very rare event. And she feigned a heart attack, saying she'd just see me throw away food, But anyway, a little while after that, that person came into Alcoholics Anonymous and got sober, and I watched her life change. And she was the person that I approached when I realised that my drinking was killing me. And while I was on my walk today, I actually got a message from her. She took me to my first ever meeting, and she was on a walk, and had heard a song that reminded her of what they called a passing out parade at Queen Mary Hospital. That wasn't when you fainted; it was when you left the place, And just reflecting on the fact that that was kind of like the start of my first very tentative steps into recovery. But what I believe really, and what I believe totally, is that I wasn't in recovery at that time when I left that treatment centre, because I was still absolutely mired in the food. And that was to be my pattern for 13 more years after that, was that I was in AA, not drinking, not drugging by a miracle, and I believed in a power greater than me, but I believed that channel between God and I was totally blocked with food. And so my life was actually getting kind of progressively worse. I was sitting back waiting to be rocketed into a fourth dimension, but it's pretty hard to be rocketed when you're eating the way I was, where I was just basically eating to live. It looked okay on the outside for a while because I had a job and material possessions, but somewhere along the line, which is why I believe today that the main problem centers in the mind, I decided it was a good idea to sponsor myself, which was a total disaster. And my life really started to unravel at the time that I took over the sponsorship. And it was just the progression of the disease, the eating and just the insanity. So eventually my marriage broke up. I was living apart from my kids, having them a couple of days a week. I'd fill the fridge with fruit and vegetables, which would actually start to rot because I was just eating takeaways the whole time. I was just, my daughter had a standing joke that, she'd come around and see all these pizza boxes, sort of littered around the place. So I always made sure that they weren't there when she was coming around, but most of the time they were. That was just the way I lived. Like my life was so unmanageable that I couldn't do the washing. If I needed a towel, I'd drive down to the department store in Kaiapoi and buy a new one. I was getting sicker and sicker, and I knew I could never shake the thought that I knew I was an addictive eater. I knew I was exactly like those people from that first meeting, and so while I was thinking of while I was mentioning that friend of mine who sent me a message today, is that I was thinking after that about surrender, and how surrender for me has always come from asking for help. It hasn't come from, and this might work for other people, I don't know, but it hasn't come from sitting on the beach in the lotus position at sunrise, instantly accepting that there's a power greater than me. It's always come through the experience of other people and the asking for help, because in doing that, I was admitting I couldn't do it, and so why I say that is that I believe my recovery here started when I asked for help here, and I got to the point where the eating was killing me, like physically, but mentally, emotionally, whatever, and spiritually certainly. And I was away overseas working, and I ended up in a really embarrassing situation of my own making. And I remember being back in the hotel. It was expensive too. It was a $1,200 mistake that I made. And I remember in this hotel room in Paris, sitting there just knowing that I was as powerless over food as I was over alcohol, and that I needed to come back here when I got home. And I needed to do what was suggested here, because I'd come in and out over the years, but I was never willing to do what people here were doing. And it didn't stop me eating for the rest of that trip, but I knew that something was changing. I still ate my way around Europe for a couple more weeks, but so when I did get home and repaid the money I owed my company, and I did start coming back to meetings, but I still tried to keep that. I still had that kind of what it talks in the 12 and 12 as anxious apartness. I still felt different, and I remember having all these I had all these barriers to coming back here, and one was, gender, which was, it sounds crazy now, but it was sort of, I'd kidded myself that, this was a woman's problem. Don't believe that today, and it was never true. But and another one was that it was the same program as AA, so I just need to go there. That never worked for me neither. I'm definitely somebody that needs to be around recovering addictive eaters. And so I came to meetings, but I still wasn't kind of fully in the hub for a while. I was still trying to do it myself, and I used to go to this lunchtime meeting, which was basically sort of, I think it had been a big meeting once, but it was sort of petering out a bit. It was I think it was on a Thursday or something. And at one particular meeting, there was only one other person there, and she was new like me, but she'd got a sponsor and was on a food plan, and she was sharing about how great this was. And So after the meeting, I badgered her for her food plan. She very reluctantly told me what she was having. I went back to the office and I wrote it down. And so I had, her breakfast and her lunch, and then Tony's dinner. And so when I woke up in the morning, all I could think about was Tony's dinner, what I would be having that night. And it was like a loop track in my mind. Well, you didn't have much last night, so maybe a bit more tonight. Or it was Indian last night, so maybe Chinese. It was because I was going to this food court and basically just having free choice. Still totally obsessed with the food. And a little while after that, I remember, I can still see the particular bit in the old room at St. John's, upstairs, where I asked somebody who'd been around to my house all those years before, I think it was 17 years earlier, how she thought it would work if I got a food sponsor in this fellowship and kept my main sponsor in AA. My main sponsor in AA at that time was basically just a mate that I had a cup of coffee with occasionally after a meeting. And she looked at me and said, well, knowing you, Tony, that wouldn't work at all, and then turned away and walked away. And so I must have brooded about that for a week. But I can't remember ever making a decision that I was going to ask for help. But I remember that the following Monday night, being back at that meeting and sort of just wishing that the meeting would end, so I could go up and and talk to this person again. And I did. When the meeting was over, I went up and I asked if she would help me, and I was asked, was I entirely ready to give up the food? And I remember saying, I'm not 100% sure, but I think I am. I can't do it. And the next day, I was told to ring at a certain time, and I couldn't wait to make that call. And I found myself saying, yes, that'll be fine. To all the things that in the past I thought, no, I could never do that. No, not for me. And within an hour or so, I've got my then, I think he was 11, my son, with me at Farmers in Rangiora, buying all these kitchen utensils and things that, and starting a food plan. But for a little while, I thought the answer was in the food plan. And I'd hear people say the answer's not in the food plan, and I think, well, what do they mean? And what I think they meant was the answer is in the 12 steps. It's the steps. It's God that expels the obsession. But for me, the food plan was the equivalent of putting the plug in the jug, with alcohol. And I remember I was a bit embarrassed at first to say that I was coming here. People knew that I was in AA, and so I told my boss that I would have to be away from work on Monday and Friday nights. So I had to be, I couldn't work Monday and Friday nights. And he said, "Oh, so you're off to AA?" And I wouldn't say yes, but I wouldn't say no. I wouldn't, for a little while, and then I realised that things had changed one night when I was in the cafeteria at work where we had the TV on, and I was having to prepare something for my meal because I was pretty disorganised in those days, and I was standing, I had my scales and measuring cups out, and I was preparing this thing, quite oblivious and just talking to people, workmates, about what was on the news, and I couldn't believe it, because I was always ashamed, kind of. So, my thinking changed despite myself, and I believe that, that my recovery started from when I asked for help, here. That prior to that, I was 13 years dry of alcohol and drugs, but I wasn't in recovery then. And I hear people here say that they've had two lives, and I hesitate to say this because I don't mean it to sound like I'm trumping that, but I feel like I've had three lives. I've had the life of full-on addiction, the life of half-baked addiction, which was what recovery was what was told when I got here that I was half-baked, which was true. So free of alcohol and drugs in AA, and then I've had, sobriety as we know it in AEA, free of all, mind-altering substances. And because since the day I asked for help, I haven't had to eat, no matter what's happened in my life, good or bad. And I know that's not me doing that. It's definitely God. It's definitely a power greater than me. I'd love to say that I'm totally free of self, but that's not the case. And the longer I'm here, the more I come to understand that the main problem centers in the mind. It's in my thinking. And if I can just sit back on the couch, not literally, but just sit back and watch those thoughts just go through, it's fine. But the thoughts I don't have today, no matter what happens, is I don't think of eating, drinking, or drugging. And I thought I'd be battling that all my life. So I get great hope here, just as I did that first time I came here, and I heard people say that they didn't have the obsession to eat anymore. But I see people here getting better all the time, just no matter how long they've been here. So one of the great bright spots, I think, is seeing people come in here and get well. And so today, I'm not bashful about being a member of Addictive Eaters Anonymous. I'm happy to tell anyone, because it's definitely saved my life. And we talk in the big book about not regretting the past. For a while, I did regret that I didn't stay here when I first came here. But that wasn't my path at that time. The self-will was so strong. They had to be smashed. The ego had to be smashed a bit in that regard. But I do believe today what I first heard at AA a long time ago was that there's no limit to how far you can go here, because there's no limit to God. So I'm grateful for Addictive Eaters Anonymous, and I know it'll be here for many, many years, and it's great to see new people come in. Like just having newcomers at the meeting recently has been a real boost. I've really enjoyed that, Tina, and I think I've run out of things to say, and I'll just sit down.